Hello everybody, Ben Rogers here, 3&D Basketball, back with another video, and today we're breaking down the most consistent and inconsistent players for the 2019-2020 NBA season. Consistency is sometimes an overlooked skill when judging an NBA player's overall ability, but for coaches and teams, it's essential to know what you're going to get from a player on a night-in, night-out basis, especially when you're developing game plans for important games like the playoffs, which we're currently in. You want to know who the most reliable guys on your roster are. Because consistency is such an important thing a player can have in their game, I want to be able to find a way to quantify how consistent an NBA player is to figure out who are the most and least reliable players across the NBA. But before we do that, we have to really figure out what consistency really means in this context, because it's not something clear-cut like points per game or rebounds per game or even field goal shooting percentage, but something that is sort of relative to your own performance, to your own ability. I would define it as how reliable is a player at providing a certain amount of output on every single given night. And in this context, we'll be talking about scoring the basketball specifically. So to put that to an example, let's just say you had a player A and player B both play 4 total games and both average 10 points per game. If player A scored 10 points in their first game, 10 points in their second game, 10 points in their third, and 10 in their fourth, they'd be a pretty consistent player, as obviously they're scoring the same amount of points on every single given night. There's no variance for that player. But the second guy, let's just say he averages 0 points per game on the first night, or scores 0 points in the first game, scores 20 in the second, 0 in the third, 20 in the fourth, then that guy still, they both average the same amount of points, but the second player, player B, is clearly more inconsistent because he has a more varied scoring output over the course of those 4 games. Now, if we were to apply this to an NBA player's regular season and figure out how varied their scoring performances are, we can actually quantify that mathematically by something which is called a variance. And we can apply that to every single game log that we have for that current season and figure out, from that variance, figure out the standard deviation for each player's scoring output. Now, that will give us an idea of how varied their scoring performances are in the same way we compared player A to player B in that relative example. Then we just adjust for points per game, because clearly someone that's averaging 28 points per game is going to have a wider range of scoring outputs than someone that averages 5 points per game. Adjust for that, then we can have a strong indication, a strong quantification of how consistent an NBA player has been over the course of that season. If you want to take a deeper look at how that calculation was made, I wrote an article that I left in the description below, so definitely check that out if you're interested, but definitely had some interesting results from who the most inconsistent players are across the league and who are the most consistent. So let's dive straight into those. So we'll first take a look at the most inconsistent guys in the NBA, and Kyrie Irving takes home the crown as the league's most inconsistent player for the 2019-2020 NBA season, and this kind of makes sense. He was having a pretty up and down season for the Nets before he went down with injury, only played about 20 games, which is a solid enough sample size, but he won this by a pretty large margin, so that was pretty interesting to look at. And if you see the list that's on the screen, the top 20 is pretty rounded out by ball dominant, score first, shooting guards and wings, which seems to make sense given their playing style. Whether it be superstars like Damian Lillard or role players like Norman Powell, these guys take higher degree of difficulty shots, such as high volumes of threes or contested layups, and that play style sort of lends itself to inconsistent basketball. So it makes sense to see a lot of those guys in the top 20 most inconsistent players in the league. Joel Embiid also makes an appearance in the top 20, which is likely a reason for the Sixers' struggles this year. Obviously, if Joel Embiid was able to come in and provide those averages on a night-in, night-out basis, it would likely lead to a lot more wins. Unfortunately, they had such an abysmal home and away record, so a lot of that was due to Joel Embiid's play. So hopefully if he plays more consistent in these NBA playoffs, they'll have better results against their matchups. One thing to keep in mind when looking at this stat is the correlation between standard deviation in minutes and inconsistency, which makes sense. I'll throw the graph on the screen, but the more varied your minutes are on a game-by-game basis, it makes sense you're going to play more inconsistency. That intuitively, it seems right. You know, players that get 5 minutes on one given night and then 25 the next, they're going to have different scoring outputs on a night-by-night basis. So that makes sense to see that correlation is there, and we see a couple guys really take the hit on their inconsistency score because of this. Players like Gary Trent Jr., who really exploded in the bubble, he scores highly in inconsistency because of this. Shake Milton's another player, so that's something we probably could have adjusted for as well in the stats, but didn't do it. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at this list, but still really interesting to see the players that did make it score highly in this inconsistency ladder. Now we're going to look at the other side of the spectrum and see the players that were really reliable for their teams over the course of this NBA season. You can see on the screen, it's posted up there now, that there's a lot of guys that from the eye test don't really seem to force the issue when they're playing the game. They seem to really play within their offense and play within the flow, and the two most notable names on this list are clearly LeBron James and Giannis Antetokounmpo, who are front runners for this year's MVP, and their ability to give the same amount of output at such a high level on every given night is probably a reason they're both leading their teams to first in their respective conferences. So it's interesting to see superstars on one hand be very all over the place on any given night, but guys that are established top tier players like LeBron and Giannis be given the same sort of output night in, night out, so that's really cool to see. Zion Williamson, the star rookie for the New Orleans Pelicans, also showed a tremendous amount of reliability this year, which is also pretty interesting for him because he was on a huge minutes restriction and he was putting up ridiculous stats for considering the amount of minutes he was playing per game. So that's got to be really encouraging for Pelicans fans, despite the fact they really struggled in the NBA bubble, to see that Zion in his rookie year, with everything that happened on top of the pandemic to his season, that he was really reliable for their team. We also see a couple guys on the Oklahoma City Thunder, Danilo Gallinari and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, score highly in the consistency rating, which is probably a big factor in the reason that the Oklahoma City Thunder outperformed so many people's expectations. Their ability to just come in, night out, and play their games and get what's taken from. It's a big reason Billy Donovan scored highly in Coach of the Year, so shout out the Oklahoma City Thunder. But yeah, there's an interesting mix of players on this list, whether they be centers, a lot of centers out here, some three-point shooters, and gotta give credit to Marvin Bagley, who only played 13 points per game. We did see the lesser games you played. It didn't necessarily predict you're going to be more consistent or less consistent, but it did predict you're going to be more variable, so I guess it makes sense, but you still got to give credit to Marvin Bagley for winning the top and being the most consistent player in a short stint of games. But yeah, consistency is so valuable to different NBA teams, especially if you're able to play at such a high level and have such a scoring output, and this obviously only takes into account scoring, so this isn't looking at defensive consistency or turning over the ball or anything like that, just purely scoring. So let me know what you guys think about the analysis. Do you think there's some players that were missed, or were you surprised by any of the results? Let me know in the comment section below. You're the best to make this far, and yeah, definitely I'm excited to get more and more videos on this channel. Still working about how to record everything properly and get everything organized, but yeah, I really appreciate all the support you guys give us here, and as I mentioned earlier, you can check out how an article written on this sort of topic that dives in deeper to how the analysis was made in the description below, and the code will also be there will be a link to the code in that as well. So yeah, really appreciate you guys. Cheers.